Good afternoon. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and to all those who are watching us via live stream from home via the internet. My name is Ian Brzezinski. I'm a senior fellow at the Scowcroft Center here at the Atlantic Council. That good to go? We're invited this afternoon to host this public discussion, panel discussion, and the launch of Dr. Matthew Kroenig's latest report, Developing a Strategy to Deter Russian Nuclear De-escalation Strikes. Copies of that report are available in the lobby for all those who would like to have one for this evening's reading. Big thank you to the PASC program with the US Air Force Academy and the Defense Threat Reduction Agency for their support for this project, and specifically to James Smith and the others joining us today. We have an esteemed panel of experts: Matthew Kroenig, Walt Slocombe, and Elizabeth Braw, who will show up via internet. She's coming in via Skype from London. And they're going to be moderated by the equally esteemed Eli Lake of Bloomberg. Matt's report and this event come at an important time. Last February, the Pentagon released its Nuclear Posture Review, a report that described the increasingly challenging international security environment featuring great power conflict and great powers adversaries with increasingly robust nuclear capabilities. The NPR articulated the need for the United States to strengthen its nuclear posture to deter strategic attacks on itself and its allies. The NPR called for deploying low-yield nuclear weapons to deter Russian nuclear de-escalation strikes. Now, the critics of that report, or that findings, some critics argue that the NPR misrepresents Russian strategy, or that low-yield nuclear weapons are not the best way to deter aggression. Matt's report makes an important contribution to this debate, and I suspect you can see its fingerprints in the NPR. Today's conversation will expand on these important themes surrounding Russian nuclear threats and the recommendations for US and NATO deterrence strategies. I encourage all of you here and at home via the internet to join today's conversation on Twitter by following @AC Scowcroft and using the hashtag US Nuclear Strategy. To kick us off, let me introduce to you our excellent moderator, Eli Lake, a columnist with Bloomberg View. Throughout his career, Eli has served as correspondent both in the United States and abroad. And before joining Bloomberg, he was a senior national security correspondent for the Daily Beast. He previously covered national security and intelligence for the Washington Times. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our panelists to the stage. And Eli, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Well, we have a great panel today. So let me introduce our panelists, and then start with Dr. Matthew Kroenig, who I have gotten to know because of his work on Iraq, but he is currently the Deputy Director at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security here at the Atlantic Council. He's worked inside the Department of Defense. He's worked at the CIA. You have probably read his work in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. You can find him on many major media. And I really think he is one of the sharpest strategic thinkers we have right now in Washington. We're very lucky to kind of hear his thoughts on how to deter Russian nuclear de-escalation strikes today. Seated next to him is a man who needs no introduction, Walt Slocombe, who is currently the Secretary of the Board for the Atlantic Council, but you probably know him as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the Clinton administration. He is a veteran of arms control, having worked as an advisor on SALT talks, and also had a stint in Iraq as a senior national security advisor at the Coalition Provisional Authority. Joining us by Skype is Elizabeth Braw. She is a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council. She's a senior consultant at the London headquarters for control risks. You can read her in the Christian Science Monitor, Newsweek, The Times, Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and Politico. She is a native of Sweden and attended university in Germany. and has some pretty impressive degrees in German literature with a dissertation on nuclear weapons reduction in Europe. So without further ado, I will hand it off now to Matthew. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Eli. I'd also like to begin by thanking the Project on Advanced Systems and Concepts for Countering WMD with US Air Force Academy and Deter for their support of this project, and to Dr. James Smith. Thanks to my panelists for joining me today, and thanks to all of you for coming out on a rainy afternoon to discuss this important topic. So the report, which is released today, looks at the threat of Russian nuclear de-escalation strikes, argues that the United States and NATO need to have their kind of own limited nuclear retaliation options to deter this threat, and that the United States and NATO need new low-yield capabilities to support this strategy. So I just want to, in my opening remarks, hit 3 points. First, the Russian threat. Second, the needed US and NATO strategy. And third, touch on the capabilities. So first, the Russian threat. As you may know, the US Nuclear Posture Review argues that Russian nuclear strategy calls for the early use of nuclear weapons to de-escalate a conflict with the United States and NATO. So basically, the idea is if they get into a major war with NATO, rather than lose that conflict, they could use nuclear weapons first in a way to try to frighten Western and US leaders into backing down on terms favorable to Moscow. And so that poses a real threat to the United States and NATO, and I think presents the most plausible path to nuclear exchange between the United States and Russia that we've faced really since the Cold War. So I know we'll be talking more about that because some people have questioned whether this is really Russia's strategy or not. I think my view on that is that you can never be certain what an adversary is going to do, but there's more than enough evidence here that it would be irresponsible for the United States and NATO not to have a strategy to deal with it. So in terms of strategy, I think that the Russians are motivated toward this strategy by what they see as 3 asymmetries. I think they see an asymmetry in stakes, an asymmetry in resolve, and an asymmetry in capabilities that facilitates this approach. So first, in terms of stakes, I think the Russians believe they care more about Eastern Europe than the United States and the West does. Therefore, they're more willing to run a risk of nuclear war in those kind of conflict zones. Second, that they're more resolved to threaten and use nuclear weapons, that the Russians are just more comfortable using and threatening nuclear weapons than Western leaders are. After all, we've been de-emphasizing nuclear weapons for a quarter century, while they've been moving in the other direction. And third, they see a gap in capabilities. At the end of the Cold War, we basically shed all of our tactical nuclear capabilities, but the Russians kept theirs and they're building more, so they have many more options for using nuclear weapons in these kind of de-escalatory strike scenarios. So essentially in the report, I argue the key to our strategy needs to be closing all 3 of these gaps, doing a better job of articulating our stakes to defend NATO allies in Eastern Europe, which I think are significant. On the resolve point, remind the world that NATO is a nuclear alliance, that we're prepared to use nuclear weapons, including in a limited fashion, to deter Russia. So in kind of plain English, if Putin thinks using 1 or 2 nuclear weapons is a war-winning strategy, we have to convince him that that doesn't mean we surrender, but it means there are going to be 1 or 2 or 7 nuclear weapons coming right back at him. And then third, we need the capabilities to support this strategy. And our current tactical nuclear capabilities face real problems with Russian air defenses. Using strategic weapons in a kind of theater conflict, most likely scenarios, poses potential problems for escalation. So I think developing these low-yield capabilities that can penetrate Russian air defenses called for in the new NPR, the low-yield submarine-launched ballistic missile and the new low-yield nuclear weapon on a sea-launched cruise missile makes a lot of sense. So that basically summarizes the report, so I'll end there and look forward to the discussion with you and the other panelists.
I'm a lawyer. Lawyers only talk from podiums. Matt's paper is an excellent review of the issue and of the basic facts and the main arguments. And I agree with many of its conclusions and much of its recommendations and analysis. Because I will identify some areas where I do disagree, I want to underscore that I have no difference at all with Matt's basic argument. that there is a real threat from the Russians of a limited nuclear attack, but the only realistic strategy to deal with that is to be able for NATO and the United States to mount a limited but effective nuclear response. That NATO needs to have the capabilities and be seen by Russia to have them to strike back effectively without reliance on massive escalation. And it needs to have a demonstrated resolve sufficient to convince Russia, and arguably more important than ourselves, that any use of nuclear weapons against us would be all but certain to meet some sort of NATO nuclear response and risk an escalation in which Russia has as fully as much to lose as we do. I want to begin by a brief comment on the escalate to de-escalate argument. Insofar as what the Russian doctrine says, what they routinely put in the talking points, which is that Russia will use nuclear weapons if they face, I've forgotten the exact phrase, but it's something like catastrophic injury to vital Russian security and existence. Well, that's not new. That is, in fact, if you change the rhetoric, NATO's policy. What is different is that they have talked much more quietly, but much more worryingly about using the threat or even the use of nuclear weapons as a way to backstop their own aggression. I think the most serious example of this is what Putin said in the context of Syria, in which, and I summarize and perhaps slightly exaggerate, but not much, and not in the real implication. If the invasion of Crimea had gone badly, he was prepared to alert and therefore to threaten and therefore, at least by implication, to use nuclear weapons to blow away the willingness to respond. That is a very bad extension of doctrine. And it presents a major challenge for the United States and NATO. I think one small difference that I have with Matt is I believe his paper underestimates the political. He gives plenty of attention to the problem of credibility and so on. I think that's the core of the problem, not physical capabilities. The issue here is at least as much maintaining Allied unity, solidarity, and resolve in the face of a Russia that will do its very best to foster divisions. And unfortunately, there's a good deal of responsibility of the United States in terms of the potential for divisions. There has been an erosion of the U.S. commitment and the concept of working with our allies, an appearance of ambiguity in terms of our overall approach to Russia. Some, on Wednesdays it's fine, it's pretty lousy on Thursdays. And on top of that, a sense that quite apart from anything Trump has done, the United States has behaved foolishly and irresponsibly in some areas, most prominently Iraq, but also Syria, Israel, and so on. And in the particularly as of right now, in the Iran nuclear issue. There are European factors. There's a big difference in the assessment of the problem between Central Europe and the Southern Europe particularly, but also, in a sense, most of the old allies. So I think that's very important. But there is a military dimension. I would argue that capability is the easiest part of solving this problem. It is essential to bear in mind, I think, as we look at specifics, that right now, the United States and NATO would in no way lack for executable options, even with current forces, and still more if the current modernization program is carried forward. I certainly agree. The DCA have real limitations militarily, but it's not zero. And much more important, its presence in Europe, the shared European role, and the commitment of the United States to maintain the force is at a minimum a useful demonstration of a shared burden and solidarity. Not to mention the vast controversy that any modification of the deployment, either to get rid of it or to enhance it, would cause internally within the alliance. Let me say a word about why I think that's the case, that the sufficiency is the current case. The United States, and therefore NATO, have a capability, a very broad capability for a limited response with systems other than the dual-capable aircraft in existing and even more in programmed force. Stealth aircraft, B-52s with outcomes, even though some of them, hard to believe, they're not as old as I am, but some of them were flying when I was in college. Eventually LRSO, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And we have a program which has very broad bipartisan support. It is, after all, largely developed under the Obama administration for the massive and comprehensive modernization of the entire strategic force, including of the weapons to carry. And the existing systems meet many of Matt's list of necessary features. They're all prompt. They all have a very high possibility of penetration. They are all accurate. And apparently, many, if not all of them, include a low yield option. I am more doubtful than Matt in his paper that reliance on platforms that are identified with strategic forces has a unique escalatory danger. It seems to me that the risk of excessive counterstrike, that is of a Russian, if you will, third strike, which escalates massively, it arises from the nature of a nuclear attack on a target in Russia, and not from the platform from which the strike was launched. Anyway, granted all the problems of making a decision in a crisis, there is a tremendous Russian self-interest not to mistake a limited attack as a precursor to a massive one. The Russians, like us, have made a huge investment in the ability to detect and categorize attacks precisely to avoid being preempted and to avoid having to launch something unintended. Russia may well escalate in response to a limited NATO action, but I believe they will do so by deliberate action and not by confusion or inadvertence. In sum, it seems to the problem is it's in terms of the menu of responses. There is no question that it would be immeasurably hard as a political, moral, strategic decision to decide how to respond to a particular limited nuclear attack. But I'm far from convinced that there is any significant or plausible target that the current capabilities would not have the technical capability to attack successfully. That said, there are some measures among those identified by Matt that may well be appropriate. One is certainly to make sure that there are low-yield options for the systems that I refer to. The second is to develop a single warhead version for the SLBMs. That has the advantage of relying on our best tested, our most secure, our highest penetration system, and it has the advantage of not costing very much money and being available soon, which is to say within the next, if we really wanted to do it, within the next 4 or 5 years. I find it genuinely difficult to see the point of a nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missile. In terms of what it will make possible, what missions it will make possible to execute that other systems, including the planned ones, couldn't do. Interestingly enough, it may be much more significant if we do it in terms of Asia than in Europe. And the Slocombe, a new ground-launched cruise missile, which, to be fair, the NPR treats only sort of as a subject for vague analysis, not even to be pursued like the cruise missile, the sea-launched cruise missile, seems to me a disastrous idea from the alliance point of view, and by definition would do nothing to add to the capabilities of air or sea-launched cruise missiles. I think it is far more important to ensure that we actually do the big modernization, if you believe, as I do, that the problem is not capability, but demonstrated resolve. And it is critical to strengthen conventional defense, where, to put it mildly, there is a lot more room for doubt as to the NATO's pure military capability than with any aspect of nuclear weapons. BMD, which Matt rightly endorses on a limited level, might be useful in a battlefield key target context, but the fact is that the United States has been telling the truth. Over all these years, we've been trying to persuade the Russians that no conceivable BMD in Europe will make much difference to their interests. That is, the problem of deterrence is not primarily material or even military. It is political, and it involves both Russia's perception and the alliance much more than with the details of structure. Just one final point. In this context, if you look at it from a political point of view, public support is critical. One of the characteristics of the alliance is that for all of our various failings, they are all democracies. And there is an important domestic U.S. dimension to this. Remember that 90% of what's in the NPR was started under the Obama administration. And the NPR is greatly to be commended for having a tone of moderation and continuity, well, not uncritical, that is all too rare in this city today. And second, that conventional response is a critical element of nuclear deterrence and of resolve. A serious conventional defense is essential. It might be successful, definitely better than total reliance on nuclear weapons. And importantly, it means that Russia would have to mount a large-scale effort to be sure of a successful conventional offensive. And NATO is doing some very significant things to enhance this, and we need to continue to do it. I want to leave with an insight from Michael Quinlan, who I think has been the single analyst who has said the most perceptive things about nuclear deterrence in the entire period. He expressed it so far more eloquently than I can, but his basic message was that the central problem of deterrence as a whole, including nuclear deterrence, is deterrence of conventional war, not only because of the catastrophic destructive potential of a conventional war fought with modern weapons, but precisely because, and this is the link to nuclear deterrence, virtually every plausible scenario for a nuclear war grows out of a conventional conflict. Thanks.
Thank you. Elizabeth.
Thank you very much for having me, and Matt, congratulations on a very well-argued and well-timed paper. Now, the issue of communications has been mentioned a couple of times, and for just now, demonstrated resolve and public support is critical. And I want to focus on the aspect of strategic communications in deterrence, and you mentioned it as well, Matt, in the paper. I'm reading here that it will require that the United States and NATO adjust and enhance their declaratory policy, strategic communications, alliance management, war planning, and nuclear capabilities. And it seems to me that nuclear weapons policy or deterrence is like the boys who say to each other in the playground, "My dad is stronger than your dad." "Oh, no, my dad is stronger than your dad." And it's all backed up by the fact that those dads may or are willing to engage in a fist fight if it came to that. And I think that's where we are, that we must, in the current situation, that we have to communicate whatever the nuclear policy is, and I think it's pretty clear that has remained unchanged for the most part, we have to communicate that threat that you mentioned, Matt, the threat of limited nuclear reprisal. We have to communicate it much more strongly, even if we still want to take the high road and not even contemplate using nuclear weapons. And so, to go back to the...
Elizabeth, sorry, just to interrupt you for one moment. We can't hear you very well. Could you, do you have headphones you could put in? Or just make sure nothing's obstructing the microphone? Thank you.
Okay. Should I go back to where I started, or...?
Yeah, if you could, just your last point. Thank you.
Okay, let's see here. Is this better?
Yes, that's better. Thank you.
Better enough. All right. So back to the beginning, or just back where I left off?
Just where you left off.
Okay. So to go back to the schoolyard and the potential fist fight between the dads, it only works, that threat, from one boy to the other, if the dads are actually willing to contemplate engaging in that fist fight. And so that brings us to the issue of strategic communications. And of course, in this case, strategic communications are directed towards both Russia and our own wider public. And as you mentioned earlier, public support is critical. But if you look
Elizabeth, I'm really sorry to interrupt you again. Is there any chance you could hold the microphone to your mouth, just because it keeps getting obstructed by your hand?
Okay, that's it. Can you hear me now?
We
Is this better?
Sorry, if you could just speak and we could...
All right. So looking at public support for nuclear weapons, there was a recent survey by Stanford University last year that showed, that documented an 86% approval rating for the Hiroshima bombing in a poll from August 1945, whereas last year when the poll took place, there was only a 46% approval rating, or only 46% of those polled said that Hiroshima was the right thing to do. And if we look at the current situation outside the US, we all know who won last year's Nobel Peace Prize. We also know the results of the General Assembly vote on a ban on nuclear weapons, UN General Assembly vote. And in Germany, which is of course a critical host of, a crucial host of US warheads, 71% of Germans wanted Germany to sign that nuclear weapons ban last year. So I guess my point is, and I hope you can hear me now, my point is that in order to threaten, in order to de-escalate, if we want to threaten in order to de-escalate, we have to communicate that threat in an effective way to both our adversaries, specifically Russia, and to our own wider public. And those are obviously two very different messages. And in social media, I think the worry or the risk is that we'll have much more widespread criticism.
I'm really sorry to interrupt you again. I think we'll try and call you via audio just because we really can't hear you very well at all. I don't know if something's obstructing your microphone on your laptop or anything. But the noise is really bad, so I'll just shoot you a quick email to get your phone number. Eli, if you want to.
Okay, so let's go on to the discussion.
Great.
Dr. Kroenig, my first question is for you, and I'm going to ask a very non-specialist question. Do you think there is any doubt in Moscow that even if they launched a limited nuclear strike in the context of a hybrid operation against a NATO ally, that there would not be a massive retaliation and a nuclear retaliation from the United States and its allies? And if not, explain where the ambiguity is.
Unfortunately, I think there is doubt now in Moscow about that, and indeed I think there's some confidence that they could get away with this. And if you find that implausible, just put yourself in the shoes of a U.S. president or a Western leader. Imagine a scenario where Russia replays its kind of playbook from Ukraine against a Baltic state. This time it's a NATO ally, not Ukraine. So Article 5 should be invoked. The United States and NATO, I think, should go to war to defend our allies. But if we're engaged in this conventional campaign and Russia uses a nuclear weapon, say on an air base in Poland, and you're the president of the United States, or you're Prime Minister or Chancellor Merkel, what would you do? Would you really retaliate with a large-scale nuclear attack, knowing full well that Western Europe hasn't been hit, the United States hasn't been hit, so you're potentially opening up the rest of Western Europe and the United States to a large-scale Russian nuclear reprisal? Do you back down? And I've talked to many people in doing the research for this report who said, yeah, if I were president, I would back down. I would say it's not worth it. I'm not risking a nuclear war over Estonia. Others would say fight through it conventionally. But what if Russia is willing to continue to use nuclear weapons? They're not just symbolic weapons. They could have a devastating battlefield effect. So I think the only response is a limited nuclear response. But if the United States and NATO are unwilling to fight a nuclear war over the Baltics, then there's reason for Russia to believe they can get away with this. And
that's a good answer, but I want to probe a little bit more.
Yep.
Specifically, do you think that there's a doubt in the minds of the Russians? Because I agree with you, they've been pushing the envelope and probing our responses on a number of things. Ukraine's a great example, Syria is a great example. That introducing nuclear weapons in any context whatsoever would not invite a massive retaliation and probably nuclear as well.
Massive.
Not massive, but there would be a nuclear retaliation.
Those are very different.
Fair enough.
questions.
As a non-expert on this, that's my that's where I really want to. I mean, and do you think that the Russians are unclear on this point? That's my point.
I think not only are they unclear, that their hunch is they can get away with a limited nuclear strike.
Okay.
And I think part of the proof of that too is in their strategy. Some of the writings, some of the exercises. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that they have this escalate to de-escalate strategy, which is essentially a bet that they can use a small number of nuclear weapons, and the United States and the West will back down. I think they're wrong about that. I think our strategy needs to be to further disabuse them of that, and that's what the report calls for. But as of right now, I do think that they think they might be able to get away with it.
Paul, I want you to chime in on this. Do you think the Russians are in any doubt that if they introduce nuclear weapons, there would be a nuclear response?
I think they're uncertain what the response would be, and that we have a challenge to make sure that they understand. The way I would put it is that we ought to make part of our formal doctrine that any use of nuclear weapons runs a very high risk, to the point of a virtual certainty, of some nuclear response. Not of executing the PSYOP, but of some nuclear response. And you can play games with, at the very margin of whether you really mean that, but any meaningful use of nuclear weapons would produce virtually automatically a nuclear response of some kind. I mean, to play this game, they attack an airfield, we can attack an airfield. I mean, you may argue that's not right or not sufficient or too sufficient or whatever, but there's no question that we could do it. And they're rational people. I think they cannot substantially discount the chance of that kind of a response, and they certainly can't rule it out.
Okay. I want to get into another area now, and that is the disagreement between the two of you on the need to build new low-yield nuclear capability weapons. Make the case, or rather address Walt's point earlier, that we don't really need these submarine-launched missiles that deliver low-yield nuclear. We can do it other ways, and it really would have maybe be less effective in the NATO theater, more effective in the Pacific.
Well, so first there were three capabilities that Walt mentioned. I mentioned two. He added a third one. So one is the low-yield submarine-launched ballistic missile, And there's agreement. Walt also said he thinks that makes sense. So I think that's an important point of agreement. 2 is the low-yield submarine-launched cruise missile. And 3 is the research and development into an intermediate-range ground-launched cruise missile. Right. So I guess I'll start with that one and come back. So the intermediate-range ground-launched cruise missile is meant to be a response to Russia's violation of the INF Treaty. So the 1987 Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty was perhaps the most successful arms control treaty in history, eliminated an entire class of intermediate-range nuclear-armed missiles in Europe. The Russians are now violating that treaty. And so the research and development into this is meant to show the Russians that there's a cost to that violation and that we're not going to stand by as they build these capabilities. It doesn't necessarily mean we have to deploy them in Europe. I mean, it's a 7 to 10 year timeline to develop a new capability, so we have some time to figure out what, if anything, we would do with this. And it doesn't mean we'd have to deploy it in Europe. There could be advantages to deploying it in Asia, as well, I think Walt was talking about the Slocombe, but others have written about how deploying ground-launched intermediate-range nuclear capability in Asia could be helpful for extended deterrence there. Then the other capability is the sea-launched cruise missile, and Walt raised some possible costs, like the domestic and international consensus, and I think that is an important consideration, and I think that's one of the things that led to the selection of these capabilities. So the sea-launched cruise missile is not a new capability. It's a capability we had in the Cold War. We had until 2010, until it was retired by President Obama. So it's bringing a capability back, which I think makes it less controversial. Also, it's a U.S. capability based on a ship. And so this doesn't get into the problems of deploying capabilities on the ground in Europe. But the nice attributes it has is that it's low yield, it's a tactical system, it doesn't count against our new START limits, it can penetrate Russian air defenses, and so it has all the requirements we would need to execute this kind of limited nuclear retaliatory response. Are there other capabilities we could use? We could use this low yield SLBM that we're talking about bringing back. But there are advantages, I think, of having multiple platforms. And General Hyten said this in his Senate testimony on the matter, that when it comes to the strategic forces, we don't just have one capability, we have several different capabilities. And so I think if this is going to be an important part of deterring our foremost nuclear adversary, then we don't want to limit ourselves to just one possible option for responding. We want to have several options to make that threat credible.
Elizabeth, are you with us?
Yes, I am. And can you hear me this time?
Yes, I can. And so I want you to respond to that from the perspective of European public opinion. Would sea-based cruise missiles, I'm screwing up the acronym there, I'm sure.
Ground launch.
But would that in some ways maybe finesse this problem of putting new ground-based weapon systems in Europe, which I'm sure would not be popular in Germany and other places?
Well, frankly, I think there is concern about any kind of nuclear weapons, and it's not based on any particular facts. It's just a sentiment, and I don't know if you heard the figures I mentioned earlier regarding Hiroshima. Now that's obviously figures regarding the use of nuclear weapons, but in 1945, in August of 1945, 86% of Americans approved of that use of nuclear weapons, and last year was only 46%, and this year 71% of Germans said in a poll that they wanted Germany to, or last year that they wanted Germany to join the ban of nuclear weapons that was being discussed in the UN General Assembly. So there is just a very strong concern, I think, among the wider public. Now, policymakers are a different matter, but as one of Mr. Slocombe mentioned earlier, public support is critical, and the public is very vocal and very enlightened. So that's why I would argue strategic communications, both towards Russia and towards our own wider public, is vital if our deterrence is to have any or the desired effect.
Can you respond to that? I mean, I think that's an important element here, which is the public perception, particularly in Europe, of our nuclear posture in response to all that?
Well, I mean, I agree. That's my central point, that you don't, in the name of, what am I doing wrong? That you shouldn't, in the name of what I think even you would concede is a marginal improvement, you don't want to set off a debate that cannot be in the interest of Allied unity, and I think would convince the Russians not that we were more formidable, but that we were more divided. By the way, it's not that we have only one capability to launch a limited nuclear attack. I went through the list.
Right.
I mean, we have DCA, we have B-52s, we have stealth airplanes, we have air-launched cruise missiles, we have the one thing we both agree on, or one of the things we both agree on, is that it's not a bad idea to develop a low-yield nuclear option for the SOBMs. And it's certainly a good idea to make sure that in every significant category we have a low-yield option.
If I could respond to that quickly. Yeah. So we have the DCA in Europe. So these are the gravity bombs, 200 or so in Europe that would be delivered on fighter aircraft. But the idea that those would penetrate Russian air defenses is would be very difficult. And so that's of limited utility. We're modernizing our nuclear forces now, really for the first time in decades. This round of modernization is probably going to have to last us several more decades. And so we need to plan not just for current adversary capability, but for future adversary capability. And I think there are real questions about stealth going forward and whether stealth will be able to penetrate Russian air defenses. So then that leaves us with the air-launched cruise missiles in the United States now. So that would mean bringing a capability from the U.S. homeland into Europe in the event of a conflict. I think having something sea-based that could be not directly tied to the U.S. homeland and the potential response to the U.S. homeland would be beneficial. And there are also some additional benefits above and beyond contributing to deterring escalate to de-escalate strikes. Again, if we're thinking about planning over the course of the next couple of decades, currently the submarine-launched ballistic missiles, the strategic submarine-launched ballistic missiles, we believe are survivable, but will submarines always be survivable, or will anti-submarine warfare improve in a way that could call that into question? If there's some risk of that, which some people think there at least could be, then having additional nuclear weapons on submarines contributes to the survivability of our force. So we have nuclear weapons on the boomers, but also on the attack submarines. And in addition, there's the benefit of deterrence and extended deterrence in Asia. So when we retired the sea-launched cruise missile in 2010, the Japanese and the South Koreans were not happy about this. We've been telling them for years that this was to help us extend deterrence in Asia. We decided to get rid of it. Already, since the new NPR has come out, there have been Japanese and South Korean scholars who have written about how this will be very helpful for extending deterrence in Asia. Again, I think we're disagreeing on the margins here. It's an important disagreement, but it's really about this one capability. But in terms of the threat, the strategy, and the need for some new capability, there's agreement.
Elizabeth, I want to bring you back into this, and I want to touch on a point you made earlier. Do you think recent Russian predations and skullduggery in Europe could change the perceptions and opinions of, that you cited when it comes to a kind of nuclear posture in the name of deterrence, given the fact that the Russians have been so much more aggressive in the last 3 or 4 years? Is there a chance that we could see some of those opinion numbers decline against, having various nuclear capabilities in Europe?
Well, I think the objective should be to have the word or the concept deterrence more widely understood and accepted by the population, because I would say it's a positive thing, and I think the wider public would also, if introduced to the idea that it's actually that nuclear weapons on their soil or in their name or on their behalf will be used or moved somewhere on their behalf, they could become comfortable or be made comfortable with the idea if it was with the understanding that it contributes to deterrence rather than escalation. And it's a strategic communications task that would then have to be twinned with strategic communications towards Russia. But I think the good news is that that deterrence goal could serve both audiences, as it were. And it's a discussion that needs to be had among the wider European public, because some warheads are already here, and so it's not an issue that has ever gone away.
Well, I want to bring you in on this. How can the U.S. do a better job of this kind of strategic communication to the populations of our allies so that we can make the clear case that these are not meant for escalation but are meant for deterrence?
I think that represents a mistake as the focus.
Okay.
Because the problem is not to convince the European public about whether ground-launched cruise missiles are a good idea. A working majority of the people in Washington who know what a ground-launched cruise missile is are sitting in this room. The critical issue, it seems to me, and I fully agree, is first of all to explain that the threat is real. Second, to explain that it is not just a threat to the Baltic countries or to the immediate target of aggression. It is, as the alliance said, not as a matter of treaty, but it is a matter of objective fact and critical values, that an attack on one ally is an attack on all of us, not because we wrote a treaty that says that, but because it is in the nature of the international system that we want. My impression is that with respect to deterrence, it is not very difficult to say the reason we have nuclear weapons is not to find ways to use them, but to find ways to be sure we will never have to use them. And convincing the Russians that the risks of, certainly the risks of using nuclear weapons, in my view, the risk from the point of view of the Russians of using nuclear weapons, that the United States will find some kind of nuclear response, is so close to 100% as not to be a problem. Whatever we would really do, I think that's what they think. Now, they might think they could endure it, they might think they could trump the ace or whatever, but I think they believe that. And I think you have to put the case in a much broader political context as to what the alliance is about and what the threat is. And then, and only then, discuss it in terms of nuclear weapons, and then, and only then, discuss it in terms of specific programs.
I want to switch. I'm sorry, Elizabeth, go.
Can I come back?
Yeah, make a rejoinder.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that then fits into the situation, or is a good response to a scenario that we're already seeing, where various Russian representatives at convenient moments happen to mention that if one of their neighboring countries, such as Finland or Sweden or Denmark, were to take an ill-advised step, of course, Russia has nuclear capabilities, and they just happen to mention that. So we are in a sort of in a situation where we, as the West, have to emphasize our nuclear capabilities as well, not in a haphazard way, but as a reminder of our deterrent abilities.
So in addition to communicating to ourselves and to European publics, communicating to the Russians is very important as well for deterrence. And I think this is an area where we can do much better. And I think part of the reason, as I mentioned in my opening, that Russia thinks it might be able to get away with this is that they perceive an asymmetry in stakes. So kind of classic theories of deterrence say that stakes at issue are critical. You know, if one side believes it cares a lot more about an issue than the other side does, then that side can credibly threaten to run a higher risk of nuclear war to achieve their objectives. So I think when the Russians look at the Baltic states, the easternmost countries in NATO, they see this as something that they care more about than Germany, than the United States. This is their sphere of influence. It's historically been part of Russia. There are linguistic ties, economic ties. Whereas for the United States, they see it as a distant ally. But actually, I think the U.S. stake in Estonia is at least as great as Russia, if not greater, because for the United States, it's not just about the Baltic states, it's about the NATO alliance, it's about the credibility of our global commitments, it's about the non-proliferation order, it's about the rules-based international order, to use a term that's been thrown around too much. So, I mean, if Russia invades a NATO ally, uses nuclear weapons, and the United States backs down, that doesn't mean we lose NATO. I think that means the end of really U.S. credibility globally. What are the Japanese, the South Koreans going to say after we fail to defend Estonia after a nuclear weapon is used? I think that would have devastating consequences for our global commitments for non-proliferation. And so from that point of view, I think our stake is actually much greater than Russia's sphere of influence.
I want to follow up on that really quick. In the paper, you make a glancing reference at the Prague speech that Obama gave, envisioning a world without nuclear weapons. Of course, Ronald Reagan had similar sentiments. Do you think that Barack Obama or President Obama in his presidency in some ways eroded our ability to persuade Russia and Russia that we would deter them if they dared, and that maybe that they're more emboldened? Is that what you seem to be saying, or do you because I could argue the other way, that he didn't actually he's modernized the nuclear force. He eventually kind of agreed to that and other things like that. So.
Yeah. Well, to be fair, I think that this wasn't just President Obama. Every U.S. administration since the end of the Cold War has made reducing reliance on nuclear weapons a priority. Every administration since the end of the Cold War has reduced the number of U.S. nuclear weapons. So some of Obama's rhetoric, I think, went further than others, but the basic approach was there. And I do think that U.S. adversaries looked at that and said, this is a potential opportunity. If the United States is unwilling to use nuclear weapons or is reluctant to use nuclear weapons, this can give us an asymmetric advantage. And I think we see that with Russia and their escalate to de-escalate strategy. I think we may be seeing that with North Korea, that they see relying on nuclear weapons as a way to offset our conventional military superiority. And so, there's always been a tension in U.S. nuclear policy between arms control and disarmament on one side and deterrence on the other side. After the end of the Cold War, every administration up through Obama leaned a little bit more heavily on the arms control disarmament side. And I think there is a bipartisan consensus now that the time has come to lean more heavily back on the deterrence side. And I think that's exactly what you've seen in this new nuclear posture review.
Let me ask a really controversial question here. Do you think
this one's for Walt?
Yeah. Do you think Trump's loose talk of big, beautiful nuclear weapons in that respect can be maybe a serendipitous positive?
The short answer is no.
Okay.
One of the things which most undermines public confidence in the wisdom of our policy is acting as if you think nuclear weapons are just kind of something like, bombers or tanks or something. You use them. And the sort of casual approach, which is also factually total, forgive me, bullshit, is utterly unhelpful. And I think those of us who are advocates of deterrence need to realize that in the United States, we have almost uniquely among big public issues, we have a degree of bipartisan consensus. I mean it when I say the NPR, read as a whole, is a very sensible document that emphasizes continuity. Indeed, it actually says nice things about arms control. And that is a pearl of great price, that we don't want to convert this into an argument about whether or not the Obama administration was wrong, whether the Trump administration is wrong, because that will have a corrosive effect. And there's an analogous situation with respect to Europe. Just as a footnote, I agree that the future of arms control has been undermined, not by anything the United States did or has done or is likely to do, but by the fact that Russia is in violation of virtually every one of the nuclear and conventional and transparency arms control agreements to which it's a party, with the important, and even that's arguable, exception of the New START Treaty.
Picking up on that, I want to get back to deterrence really quick, but I mean, you're correct that the Russians are in violation of all those agreements. I mean, what does that mean for future arms control? I mean, I think New START expires in what, 2021? Does it make sense for the United States to try to engage with? I mean, it's the other side of the coin here, but does it make sense to engage on New START, to extend it and see what we can get?
On the whole, I think it would be, since the Russians are apparently essentially in compliance, maybe fully in compliance.
Right.
The agreement is a good agreement. It will not make the situation any. You shouldn't get out of agreements unless there's some advantage to getting out of them.
Right.
And I think, in fact, the provision should be extended. Most importantly, because it extends the verification provisions.
Okay. You want to say anything on that?
That said, apart from that, I see no prospect of a meaningful agreement, and that absolutely cannot be blamed on Donald Trump. The Obama administration moved heaven and earth to try to get something going and was met simply with rejection.
I think New START should be extended. It would be in the U.S. Interest to extend it. I would just add that I think we have to be prepared for the possibility that Russia will decide not to, given that it's violating all of its other treaties. So if Russia decides to break out of the New START limits, we need to have a hedge to prepare for that possibility.
And what does that hedge look like? I mean, because that is related to this very discussion about deterring them in this context.
Well, I think this relates to the underlying nuclear enterprise, and are we prepared? And for the past 25 years, this has been a capability we've really neglected. So the new nuclear posture review says there's going to be renewed attention to it, renewed investments, and I hope that's the case, because if you don't have the underlying infrastructure ready to go, you can't be prepared to respond if adversaries decide to break out of arms control agreements.
Elizabeth, what do you think? Is arms control totally overrated? I'm kidding. Anyway.
Well, I think one might almost ask whether it's dead. But if I can just mention one aspect of it, and because I think it illustrates very well the tension between the policy need and public sentiment, it's the ban that was discussed and voted on by the UN General Assembly. And so it resulted in a very interesting and very difficult situation in Sweden, where the foreign minister is passionately in favor of arms control and really wanted Sweden to sign this treaty, even though, of course, it doesn't really have a great significance in any way, because the countries that signed don't have nuclear weapons. But still, she wanted to sign, and the defense minister said, no way, if we're going to have closer bilateral relations with the U.S., which we need since we're not members of NATO, we can absolutely not sign this ban in case the Americans wanted to have nuclear weapons on our soil. So it just illustrates, I think, very starkly that tension that we're seeing right now, and that's why we need strategic communications to convince the wider public that nuclear weapons are maybe less frightening, or the presence of nuclear weapons is less frightening and less detrimental to world peace than they're perceived to be.
Very good. Well, let's open it up to the audience now for questions. How's that sound? And also, are we going to get Twitter questions? Or no, we're no Twitter questions. Sorry. Over here. Up front, yeah.
Peter Humphrey, I'm an Intel analyst and a former diplomat. As best I can tell, there's nothing that a low-yield nuclear weapon can do that 1,000 cruise missiles can't do.
That's not true.
Well, okay.
Go ahead.
You can talk about that. And just to avoid the appearance of moral impropriety, isn't that a better direction to go in? Of course, you have to actually have the capability to deliver 1,000 cruise missiles in 1 hour, which we don't have.
Reasonable people can debate this. There are some who I talked to in doing this report who said even if the enemy uses nuclear weapons, we should just respond with a strong conventional attack. And isn't our strong conventional capability enough of a deterrent? I think the answer to that question is no, we have a strong conventional capability, and yet the Russians, whatever we're doing, is not working. The Russians seem to think that they can get away with these limited nuclear strikes. So I think that suggests we need to do something different.
We don't know that they think they can get away with it.
We don't know what.
Then why have they been planning this, exercising it, building capabilities?
Okay, I'm saying that they haven't done it yet.
Right, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they think that this is a reasonable approach, which if they knew that we had this impressive conventional capability that was going to...
I'm just saying, as opposed to stealth invasion and annexation of Crimea, they clearly thought they could get away with it, and guess what, they did.
Right. Well, and Crimea was very much a nuclear crisis. The Russians, Putin said, we're a major nuclear power, it's best not to mess with us. He said he put nuclear weapons on alert during the crisis. And so that's the other downside of this Russian nuclear strategy. It's not only a problem if they use nuclear weapons, they use it to backstop all of their conventional aggression, use it for coercion against the United States and NATO. But conceptually, I think reasonable people can argue it either way. I would argue that if an adversary uses nuclear weapons, the moral thing to do would be for the United States to use nuclear weapons in response for the following reasons. One, if we don't use nuclear weapons in response, what is the lesson that the Russians take away from that? It might be the United States is afraid to use nuclear weapons, let's keep using them. Whereas if we use nuclear weapons, I think there's a chance of restoring deterrence and preventing Russia from continuing to use nuclear weapons. If the enemy uses nuclear weapons and we don't use nuclear weapons in response, what's the lesson that our allies around the world take from that? I think the lesson they might take away from that is the United States afraid to use nuclear weapons. We have this U.S. nuclear umbrella that's supposed to protect us. What good is this if they're unwilling to really use them? Let's consider building our own nuclear weapons. And then what's the lesson other U.S. Adversaries around the world? Again, I think they would say, well, the United States is afraid to use nuclear weapons. This is our ace in the hole. We can build nuclear weapons, rely more on nuclear weapons in our strategy as a way to go after the United States and not have to worry about a response in kind. So I think for all of those reasons, the United States, it should be, as Walt said, virtually guaranteed that if an enemy uses nuclear weapons, they should expect a U.S. nuclear response.
All right, up front here.
Bill Courtney, RAND. When original INF was deployed, it came after the German Chancellor called for NATO to pull together and counter Soviet SS-20s. Today, the INF violation, which in some sense is comparable, it's LECMs as opposed to SS-20s, there's almost no political resonance in Europe now about the INF violation. Should that have any impact on our decision whether to deploy nuclear TLAM, nuclear Slocombe, or other countermeasures?
Well, I can go first, I guess. So as part of this project, we went to Brussels and ran a workshop with European experts and officials. The security community in Europe understands that there's a threat, sees the value of U.S. nuclear deterrence and the need to respond to this. But they did acknowledge that they have a problem with public opinion. And so I came away from that workshop with two lessons. One, if you think you need new capabilities to deal with this threat, just don't put it on the ground in Europe. And so I think that's maybe part of the rationale for putting these new capabilities on U.S. ships, so you don't deal with the problems of putting things on the ground in Europe. And they said the second thing is make sure there are plenty of arms control and non-proliferation hooks, which I think you also see in the nuclear posture review, saying that these capabilities don't necessarily have to go forward. If Russia is willing to come into compliance with the INF, if Russia is willing to make major changes, then perhaps these are capabilities that we could reconsider. So I think that's at least a partial answer to your question. I'm sure maybe Walt would like to add, or Elizabeth.
Elizabeth?
Well, yes. So it's interesting how the Russian violation of the INF Treaty has essentially flown under the radar, as it were, simply because there is too much else going on. And I think by calling the Russians out on what they're doing, we the West could build public opinion against them. Obviously, public opinion against them is not is unlikely to change their behavior in the short term. But if the wider public is made to understand what's happening and that nuclear escalation, which unfortunately was in the headlines when the new review came out, the U.S. review, if the wider public is made to understand that actually Russia is already violating a treaty, there would be more understanding of why we need stronger deterrence and why they need to be brought back into the fold. And unfortunately, I can speak for the UK. There is Brexit. There are a lot of other things going on, including unstable government. Nobody really has any bandwidth left for arms control in the wider public debate. But it would be, I think, it would have an effect if it were brought to the attention of the wider public.
Over here.
Yeah, my name is Peter Stavrakis. I'm from right now formerly National Defense University. I taught there. Now I'm retired. What I see is kind of a problem is there's two different perspectives. One is let's go get the military and then talk about a strategy, and the other is let's talk about the politics first, and then we can fit our strategy or our military into that. And the third is I thought when we were hashing out this deterrence theory 30-some years ago, the point was to make nuclear war so inconceivable that it was not possible to think of it. And if you start bringing in missiles, which you say, well, they can be used lower yield, less targets, and so like, I can see from a military level that might be usable, but from a political level, you're just convincing the Russians that we are going to use them. I see no other reason for having weapons that can be used on a smaller scale, which were originally designed through deterrence capability to only be unusable on a large scale.
Hold on, don't the Russians have low-yield nuclear weapons?
Yeah, the Russians have these capabilities and much, much more. But also I'd make a few points. So first, the purpose of the strategy and the capabilities isn't to use nuclear weapons, it's to convince Putin that not to go down this path in the first place and deter him. Second, I'd question your interpretation of the history. I mean, this is, Henry Kissinger made his reputation as a young man arguing for limited nuclear options because he saw this suicide or surrender problem. Well, we'll put aside what Kissinger said. U.S. strategy from Kennedy on was to have flexible nuclear options for precisely this reason, that we didn't want to have a suicide or surrender problem, where only options are surrender or fight a full-scale nuclear war. We've always had limited options, and I see this as a continuation of that. And then also on the point of strategy, I'm glad you brought it up because I think it's the niche that this report really fills. I think many have written about the Russian escalate to de-escalate strategy. To what degree is it their strategy or not? What is the threat? Others, including myself in some of my previous reports, kind of jumped straight to capabilities and said we need new capabilities to deal with this. But I think the part that was implicit in my head that hasn't been made as explicit until this report is what is the kind of strategic rationales that's going into Russian thinking, what are the elements of strategy that the United States and NATO need to deter it. And so that's really what I try to do in this report is kind of talk about the rationale for having these limited options. It looked like you wanted to jump in there.
Well, I'm not sure this is what you're saying, but I got my start in this business under the Nixon administration. And at that time, it is now no secret, we basically had, for all practical purposes, exactly one option. I mean, there were minor variations, but they all involved thousands of weapons and so on. And Yeah, if somebody believed that you would do it, it would be a very good deterrent. But in particular, once the Russians or the Soviets got to be able to do it, there was a serious question of whether you would. And indeed, and this is at the core of the argument for flexible response or limited nuclear options or whatever you want to call it, is those kinds of responses are far more credible because they are far more plausible. A threat to, if you attack us, I will kill us both, is not a very good, leaving aside the morality, and I don't think you can leave aside the morality, it is not even a very good strategy in purely strategic and hard-headed analytic terms.
And let's get a couple more. Over here.
Hi, my name is Dmitry Pirozhan. Thank you very much for a very interesting report. My question has to do, I'm just going to read it. So I know this is a little bit outside of the report, but you do a great job of describing the stakes and the misalignment of stakes, and part of it is that Poland is so far away from us, but you underline the global stakes as well that the U.S. has in this. So I'm just wondering if it seems like NATO, to me, seems like not the perfect, ideal way to defend Europe, but they say that the perfect should not be the enemy of the good. So I'm wondering what you think about the chances of a different European security structure. Is it something that's not even possible to discuss with Putin in power? I mean, in the NATO treaty, it says that an Article 5 resolution should be resolved by the UN Security Council eventually. So I think that should be something that we should be focusing on, because, I mean, what if they attack Ukraine with a nuclear weapon, which isn't even a member of NATO? And even this is just, I don't know if it's possible in nuclear weapons to deny responsibility, but I imagine it would be very easy for them to lie. Not easy, but very habitual for them to lie about what happened. So
are you talking about like a NATO-Russia Council, like what we had in the 90s?
You thought a lot about European security. Is there any possibility for something different, and especially what if they attack a non-NATO country like Ukraine?
Well, I guess a few thoughts. One, I think there is a difference between NATO members and non-NATO members, and I think we're seeing that today, where Russia has attacked Ukraine, and the United States has provided some support. The Trump administration has been willing to provide lethal aid, sanctions against Russia because of that. But the response with a NATO member would be much different. It would mean war. Alternative architectures, I think NATO is working pretty well. I think it may be the most successful military alliance in history, and so if it's not broke, don't fix it. I think there's some tinkering we can do on the margins. I think some NATO members can do more to increase their contributions to NATO, 2% defense spending, 20% on modernization. Some NATO members are meeting that, others aren't, so that would be helpful. And the only other real alternative I've heard articulated is Putin's alternative, which would essentially be more of a sphere of influence type system, where, kind of a new Yalta, where he gets control over Eastern Europe. And I don't think that's in the U.S. interest. I don't think that's in the countries of Eastern Europe's interest. So I think I'd like to stick with the system we have.
Did Europe defend itself?
We've proved twice in the 20th century that the answer to that is no.
Can I follow up on that question really quick? You mentioned, I don't think there's any disagreement that there's a difference between NATO allies in this respect and a country like Ukraine. But when Ukraine was invaded, it was a huge violation of the commitments made in what's known, I think, as the Budapest Memorandum, Budapest Agreement. What's the implication of that? That's pretty bad.
Yeah.
Especially since I think that was a security guarantee in exchange for their nuclear weapons. So a little bit of erosion of credibility there, right?
Well, so for those of you who don't know, the Budapest Memorandum was this agreement at the end of the Cold War where Ukraine agreed to give up the nuclear weapons that the Soviet nuclear weapons that resided on its territory in exchange for security guarantees and economic assistance. But the language in the in the treaty is important. So each of the signatories, which included the United States and Russia,
In the UK, right?
In the UK, and there may have been one other, I can't remember. But each of the signatories agreed not to violate Ukrainian sovereignty, not to violate Ukrainian territory. But there wasn't, so there was an agreement, a negative security assurance.
Got it.
But not a positive security assurance. So it wasn't a treaty. The United States, it wasn't a defense treaty. The United States never said, we'll protect you from any threat. Rather, we said, we won't violate your sovereignty, and the United States hasn't. So the only country that violated that agreement, the only country that has a credibility problem is Russia, because Russia promised not to violate Ukraine's sovereignty, and then it invaded.
Okay, we're going to do a speed round. We got 10 more minutes, so I want to take, let's try to take, we got 3 questions here. Let's try to do with them in succession and see what we can get.
Thank you. I'm Christian Gorme from the Embassy of Estonia here in DC. Heard my country quite a bit. My question is, roughly 3 years ago to the day, you were speaking at IISS with Jeremy Shapiro and Sam Charap, and one of the ideas you came out with there at the time was moving U.S. existing tactical nuclear capability to Poland as a means of deterring against the de-escalatory strike in the first place. And as it relates to the ideas in your report relating to the stakes and the thought experiment against an airstrike for a NATO base based in Poland in the first place, how does that play into that, and what was the resonance to that idea at the time?
Patrick Malone, I'm a national security reporter with the Center for Public Integrity. My question is related to the U.S. nuclear weapons complex and its capabilities when it's at full throttle in modernization mode, and you add 2 more projects. Recently at a separate event, Ambassador Linton Brooks, who knows it about as well as anyone, expressed some concern that adding 2 more projects like a Slocombe and a SLBM might disrupt the modernization process. The complex has had its fair share of difficulties, even in very recent times. NNSA itself has admitted that lags behind even North Korea on production of plutonium pits. So, can we realistically expect that there won't be a disruption to the bipartisan consensus or the actual physical complex itself and its ability to produce these weapons?
Mm-hmm. Last question up here, yeah.
Thank you. Leo Michel with the Atlantic Council. Mr. Slocombe has rightly pointed out, I think, that maintaining Allied solidarity and resolve is a key issue in all of this. Mr. Kroenig, with regard to your critique of dual-capable aircraft, you put the emphasis on their lack of being able, potentially, to penetrate Russian airspace. But it's exactly for this reason, or principally for this reason, that you have a small number of those allies with dual-capable aircraft today spending considerable resources to upgrade to the F-35. You also proposed that one solution to this would be to have an air-to-surface cruise missile on such aircraft. Mm-hmm. But I think there could be a perverse effect of some of your other suggestions, because what you are doing, if I were European, I could say, well, you're calling really into question NATO's resolve, that is the resolve of NATO allies to use their dual-capable aircraft, saying that the United States should have or must have this prompt response. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of perverse and also undermines your argument that we should not allow asymmetry in resolve. I think maybe we need to give the NATO allies a little bit more credit for that resolve and not undermine it.
Mm-hmm. All right. Resolve, bipartisan consensus, and the modernization strategy. And then
I think I've got it all, yeah.
Okay.
Should we let the guest go first and then I'll finish?
Sure. Elizabeth, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, on the last question, I partially agree with the gentleman who asked the question, but the point I'd make is that if the U.S. develops all these additional capabilities that you described, Matt, it comes the result is that we Europeans will rely even more on U.S. involvement or commitment to our security. And I think the reality is, even if even if we had the legal freedom to do so, virtually no European country, except the ones who already have nuclear weapons, would develop new ones, because it's too expensive, and as you say in your report, we are somehow so pure that we won't even consider nuclear weapons. So my point is just that it would result in even more U.S. obligations or engagement in this continent.
Walt, any thoughts?
On the idea of moving nuclear weapons anywhere, but particularly way east, it has exactly zero military utility. Indeed, it's negative. It just provides another target. With respect to the nuclear enterprise, one of the things I think people aren't aware of is a remarkably high percentage of the modernization program is for the nuclear enterprise. And I agree with you that one of the dangers of controversy about marginal issues is a threat to the consensus on the modernization program as a whole, a very large part of which is needed changes in upgrade of the nuclear enterprise. And on the last question, yeah, I think we do have to take much more visibly into account that the Allies have a voice. This allows me to bring up my favorite unaccepted idea, which is to revive the nuclear planning group so that it becomes a serious forum to involve Europeans, not in arguments about particular weapon systems, but in an understanding of what's at issue and what our policy is. And my opinion is that we have an unused mechanism within the alliance that we should enhance reliance on.
Dr. Kaye, you have the last word.
All right, great. Well, thanks again for everyone for coming out. Just go quickly through the questions. So on my first stab at these issues 3 or so years ago, an article in Survival, I talked about the threat, about our need to respond, and I said we need to consider a range of capabilities for dealing with this. One of them was moving the B-61 gravity bombs further east in Europe. After further consideration, I've come around to Walt's conclusion that I don't think that that's the right way to deal with it. But some of the other things that I talked about in that report were putting low-yield weapons on SLBMs, bringing back a nuclear cruise missile. And so those are, I think, things that I still support and that the U.S. government has also come around to. On the question about the enterprise, the Department of Energy was part of the nuclear posture review. So there was Department of Energy representation in the meetings, and they supported the conclusions. So the Department of Energy's official position, anyways, that they can handle these upgrades. And, you know, putting the low-yield warhead on the SLBM is a pretty easy fix. Rob Sufer, the DASD for nuclear missile defense, in testimony recently gave a price tag to it and a time frame. I think he said by 2020, and the price tag, I don't remember, but it was in the tens of millions of dollars, basically rounding error in this field.
Rounding error and probably a low bet. But that's...
Well, maybe, but...
no, it's not significant.
Yeah, but compared to developing a sea-launched cruise missile from scratch, much
I'm in favor of one and not the other.
Yeah. And on the domestic consensus, I agree that's important. Unfortunately, I think there is domestic consensus on this issue. So I think you've seen a number of Republicans and Democrats support the conclusions of the NPR. The Republican side might be more obvious because it's a Republican administration, but on the Democratic side, you've had Brad Roberts, who is Obama's DASD for nuclear and missile defense policy, Jim Miller, who is Obama's Undersecretary of Defense for policy, Walt Slocombe, other Democrats saying that they agree with the approach in this strategy. And on the international consensus and on NATO nuclear deterrence, thanks for bringing that up, because I think this is one way where this report does go beyond the NPR, because for a long time, we've decided it was important for NATO as an alliance to have a nuclear deterrent capability. Currently, that's provided by these B-61 gravity bombs and the fighter aircraft. You're right that the strategy for dealing with the Russian air defenses was stealth fighter aircraft. I'm not a technical expert, but I do worry about whether that will give us the ability to continue to penetrate Russian air defenses into the future. And so I think that NATO has a real choice to make. Doesn't want to continue to be a real nuclear alliance or not. If not, then let's choose to go in that direction. But if so, then I think that we need to have something other than the B-61 gravity bombs in Europe. And so thinking ahead, I do think an air-to-surface cruise missile, we have the LRSO, the long-range standoff cruise missile that's planned. I think an SRSO, kind of a short-range variant of that, that could be deployed in Europe is something that would solve that problem. But that's going to require a lot of diplomatic work in NATO, and I think would have to play out over the course of years. But again, if we want NATO to have a serious nuclear capability, I think it's the direction we're going to have to think about going. Just one final thought, I guess, before I wrap up is, I started working on this report a year ago, did some of the initial writing 3 years ago, and 3 years ago, the idea that the United States and NATO were going to develop low-yield capabilities to deter Russia was very controversial. To some degree, it still is, although I've given versions of this talk since the NPR has come out, and people have said, oh, well, this is boring. You're just repeating what's in the NPR. This is so conventional wisdom. So I'm very happy to have gone from controversial to conventional wisdom, if it means that U.S. deterrence policy has improved, and I think that it has.
Well, let's thank our guests here. I think this was a really riveting conversation.
Great. Thanks, Eli.
Absolutely.
Thank you.